Hello and welcome to Revelations and Grace. I'm John Paul, and today we're continuing our series on the end times. I wanted to take a minute and announce the release of the second edition of my book, On Time. I wrote a first edition, and this is the second one, and it renovates a lot of the previous chapters, and it adds a few new chapters, which are really exciting. And instead of doing the final chapter in my first edition, I'm going to go ahead and address those 3 extra chapters I added in the second edition in this YouTube series. So if you want to buy the book, please check it out. I would love it if you did. I'm really encouraged that people have been buying this and appreciating it. I just saw this morning the 2 5-star reviews. I'm really excited about that. It's just 2, but hey, if you guys want to leave a review, I really appreciate that. Usually people don't leave reviews or star ratings, but it's encouraging and it helps the algorithm to promote it. So thank you. But I wanted to announce the second edition. It is a little late. I released it in March, but I haven't had the time or the ability to record until more recently. But today we're going to be jumping into one of those 3 chapters I added in the second edition. And this one's going to be discussing the end of the age. And many people assume that Jesus prophesied that the world itself would end. And they get this from mistranslations of Matthew 24:3 and other verses that we'll discuss later in the series, but for now we'll just focus on Matthew 24:3. And this happens when the disciples hear that the temple's going to be destroyed, and they come to Jesus and they ask, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, in some translations, you will see the word world used, like in the New Living Translation or the King James Version. But a more accurate translation is age, as say the Berean Standard Bible does, or the English Standard Version, or the New International Version. And this is a more accurate term for this word. You can see in the Greek, the word age is aeonos. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And aeon, which can mean age or world or ages. It can sometimes mean world, but it's kind of like the world of Babylon or the world of Persia or the world of Rome. I think it's more world in that sense, maybe. But the word age, we think of the earth as divided into ages. You have the golden age of different empires, the golden age of Greece, the golden age of Rome. And what happened is when the disciples were admiring the temple, Jesus came and told them, "Hey, you see this temple and how amazing it is? It's going to be completely destroyed and not one stone is going to be left on another." And when the disciples heard this, immediately a lot of prophecies came to mind from the Old Testament scriptures. Remember, the disciples had the Old Testament. And so they would have remembered, well, if he's talking about the destruction of the temple, he's talking about the end of the Old Covenant age. He's talking about the time when the temple will be destroyed and God will usher in his kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. And so that's what they ask him. They come to him privately and say, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so what they're asking him is, since you told us the temple's going to fall, then that means the new age is coming. When is that going to happen? And they're getting this from Daniel 12. They're also getting it from Deuteronomy 32. And I'm going to add in some New Testament chapters from Hebrews 9 and Revelation 11. And these all singularly connect the fall of the temple to the end of the Old Covenant age and the resurrection of the dead and the judgment and the 3.5 years of tribulation. And this is a consistent theme through Scripture, and Jesus taught that all of this would happen in his generation, including the abomination of desolation. And we see him telling us that would happen in his generation in Matthew 24:34, where he says, "This generation will not pass until all these things have taken place." So to start, we're going to talk about Israel's last days, and the best place to talk about this is Deuteronomy 31 and 32. And this foretells the time that Old Covenant Israel would cease. And it's because they would fail to keep the law. In Deuteronomy 31, Moses is talking to the people, and he says, "For I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves, and turn away from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will happen to you in the latter days, because you will do that which is evil in Yahweh's sight, and provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. And he says all of that to Israel. And then in the next chapter, we see the Song of Moses. It's called the Song of Moses. And it's a song he taught the people as a prophecy of what would happen to them in the last days. And I'm doing excerpts from this chapter. I'm skipping through verses so you can see some of the highlights that are important for today's discussion. But it says verses like, they have dealt corruptly with him. They are not his children because of their defect. They are a perverse and crooked generation. Remember this term. This is important because you'll see it referred to later in the series. But he says this future generation of Israel will disobey his commands. They will be a perverse and crooked generation. And this is talking about what their end will be when God ends his contract with Old Covenant Israel. He later says in the Song of Moses, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be, for they are a very perverse generation, children in whom there is no faithfulness. I'm skipping ahead. Oh, that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. For their vine is the vine of Sodom, of the fields of Gomorrah. Now this is interesting because God is comparing this future generation of unfaithful Israelites to Sodom and Gomorrah. He's saying they're going to be just as bad, maybe worse, than Sodom and Gomorrah. And this comes into play in Revelation. You'll see that John in the book of Revelation also refers to a present time, Sodom and Gomorrah in his day. And it's coded language to refer to this Israel as is decoded here in Deuteronomy 32. God says, vengeance is mine and recompense at the time when their foot slides, for the day of their calamity is at hand. Their doom rushes at them. So God is saying that these days, the last days of Israel, would be the days of vengeance. And we know this is written to Israel. Moses came and spoke all the words of the song in the ears of the people. He and Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses finished reciting all these words to all Israel. So this was a prophecy about Israel's future doom. It would be the days of vengeance. They would be called Sodom and Gomorrah. It would be their end. They would be a perverse and crooked generation. Well, the New Testament authors understood that their generation was the crooked and perverse generation. In Philippians 2, verses 14 through 16, Paul says that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without defect, in the middle of a crooked and perverse generation. He was calling his own generation the crooked and perverse generation, and he was referencing Deuteronomy 32. Peter also echoed this warning, save yourselves from this crooked generation. The apostles all understood that their generation was the terminal, crooked, and perverse generation, prophesied in Deuteronomy 32, because Jesus explicitly told them so. In Matthew 17:17, Jesus answered, faithless and perverse generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I bear with you? Bring him here to me. So he was calling his own generation the faithless and perverse generation that was prophesied in Deuteronomy 32, that Israel in their last days would be destroyed. This would be their end. That's why Jesus was saying the temple would fall in their generation, because they were that final generation. And that would mark the end of the Old Covenant age. Deuteronomy 32 also has other special connections in the New Testament. For instance, in verse 21, God says to Israel, they have moved me to jealousy with that which is not a God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities. I will move them to jealousy with those who are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. And so what God is basically saying is the Israelites have cheated on me. I'm supposed to be their God, but they're here worshiping idols and other gods. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat on Israel. Instead of being exclusively Israel's God and make them solely my people, I'm going to expand the right to become children of God across all the world to whoever believes in me. Among the Gentile nations, they're also going to be invited to be part of my people. And that's going to make Israel jealous. They cheated on me, so I'm going to open up salvation to the entire world. It's part of God's wisdom, and Romans talks a lot about this. And Isaiah 65 echoes the same prophecy. In verses 1 and 2, it says, I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. That's God saying he would reveal himself to the Gentiles. I was found by those who did not seek me. To a nation that did not call my name, I said, here I am, here I am. What God is saying is when he presented the gospel, just as he sent Paul among the Gentiles and sent the Holy Spirit among the Gentiles, he was reaching to the Gentiles who had not sought him, who had not asked to know him. And he was doing his miracles among the Gentiles. And because of that, many of them believed. But he's upset at Israel in this verse. It says, all day long I have held out my hands to an obstinate people who walk in the wrong path and follow their own imaginations. God's explaining his frustration with his own people, Israel, because they are his people. They did call out to him, and he's trying to be their God, but they keep worshiping other gods and disobeying his commands and not trusting him. And what God is now saying is, I'm going to make a people who are not my people, now my people. And this will provoke Israel to jealousy. And Romans 10 goes into this in detail. Romans 9, 10, and 11 talk about this quite a bit. But in Romans 10, Paul talks about how there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, and is rich to all who call on him. For whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. And in Romans 10, verses 19 through 21, it says, but I ask, didn't Israel know about this salvation? First, Moses says, and he's quoting from Deuteronomy 32 here, I will provoke you to jealousy with that which is no nation. I will make you angry with a nation void of understanding. That's talking about how God would extend salvation to the Gentiles. And he connects Deuteronomy 32 with Isaiah 65. Isaiah is very bold and says, I was found by those who didn't seek me. I was revealed by those who didn't ask for me. But about Israel, now Paul's telling us that Isaiah 65 verse 2 is about Israel. But about Israel, he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. So let me go ahead and open this up in Romans. This is Romans 11. I need to be in Romans 10. You see, here's where I was quoting from. He says, but not all the Israelites accepted the good news. So he's talking about how Israel overall, even though some of them have accepted the gospel, most of them have rejected it. And Paul quotes from Deuteronomy 32 here. He quotes from Isaiah here. And he talks about how he would invite the Israelites into his people, or invite the Gentiles into his people. And he explains that God doing this was meant to provoke Israel to jealousy in order to save more of them. So you see in verse 11, in chapter 11, verse 11, again I asked, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Paul's talking about Israel. Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, by killing their Messiah and not believing in God's salvation and grace. Because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So do you remember in Deuteronomy 32 where he said, I will move them to jealousy with those who are not a people? That's what Romans 11 is saying, that the Gentiles being invited into God's people was intended to make Israel envious. Now, despite the fact that most of Israel rejected God, some of Israel did accept God, and Isaiah 65 describes this. He says, as the new vine is found in a cluster of grapes, so I will act on behalf of my servants. I will not destroy them all. So he wouldn't destroy all of Israel for being unfaithful. And we see that this is verse 8 and 9. So you can see here, this is Isaiah 65, where he talked about how he would extend salvation to the Gentiles. And then down here, he's saying he wouldn't destroy all of them. Now, this is the same chapter that talks about the new heavens and earth. And that's important to mention because it's going to come into a later video. This is all the same context. So just note that. But Paul emphasized that this remnant existed in his generation. In Romans 11:5, I'm going to go back to that. He says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. He's talking about Israel, how most of Israel had rejected the gospel, but there was a remnant that had chosen to believe. You know how Jesus said, wide is the path that leads to destruction, but narrow is the gate to life. He's not talking about how Christianity isn't going to be loved across the whole world for all time. He's talking specifically to Israelites, saying that the majority of them were going to reject the gospel. broad is the way to destruction, but there was going to be a remnant that would believe in him and his ministry and would be saved as a result. And that's what Paul's saying. So if you're saying, well, there's not going to be many people in heaven because broad is the way that leads to destruction, as narrow is the path of life, that was specifically contextualized to Israel. That was written to Israel in their first century generation, because they would reject the Messiah. That would be the wicked and perverse generation. It wasn't written to all Christians for all time. So as you see, right now we have 2.2 billion Christians in the world. It's widely accepted in every country. And sure, you can argue maybe some of them aren't all Christians, and I understand that not everyone who says they are a Christian are, but you can certainly say out of 2.2 billion, there's got to be a lot of genuine ones in there. And it's accepted in pretty much every country. In America, for instance, we tolerate Christianity much better than most of the world has. And so it's just, I would say broad is the way to eternal life, because God's made his grace so appealing. Who wouldn't want this grace? Well, another thing that Deuteronomy 32 said is he talked about how those days would be the days of vengeance. Vengeance is mine and recompense. At the time when their foot slides, for the day of their calamity is at hand, their doom rushes at them. And he also says, for a fire is kindled in my anger that burns to the lowest Sheol, devours the earth with its increase, and sets the foundations of the mountains on fire. And this is echoed in 2 Peter 3:10, where he says, the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. And you see this again in Revelation 20, where he talks about the final great white throne judgment. And he talks about how Sheol, death, and Hades would be thrown into the lake of fire. And death, Hades, and Sheol are the same thing. And this is what Deuteronomy 32 is prophesying, that Sheol would be destroyed in this time, in these days of vengeance, which are talking about Israel's last days, which Jesus said were happening in his final generation. You see that Revelation 20:14, death and Hades, or Sheol, were thrown into the lake of fire. And Jesus specifically told the disciples that his days were the days of vengeance. In Luke 21, verses 20 through 22, it says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the middle of her depart. Let those who are in the country not enter therein. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. So he's talking about days of vengeance that were written in Israel's past. And that would be referring to Deuteronomy 32. Those days of vengeance, Jesus were saying, these are the days of vengeance. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies and its temple gets destroyed, you're seeing the days of vengeance. Isaiah 65 also describes the days of vengeance as a time when that terminal generation would not only be punished for their sins, but also for the sins of all their fathers. So in Isaiah 65 verses 5-7, it says, they say, keep to yourself, do not come near me, for I am holier than you. Such people are smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all day long. Behold, it is written before me, I will not keep silent, but I will repay. I will pay it back into their laps, both for your iniquities and for those of your fathers. So Isaiah 65 is warning them. Let me show you this in the actual context so you can see it. So here he's saying the same things I just read in a different translation, but both for your sins and the sins of your ancestors. So that's Jesus talking about he's going to pay them back for that. And Jesus says the same thing to the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, verses 29-39, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the tombs of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore, you testify to yourselves that you are children of those who killed the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you offspring of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of Gehenna? Therefore, behold, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth. From the blood of righteous Abel, he was, very early, Cain and Abel, the children of Adam, and Eve. So this is going all the way to the beginning of time, to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Barachiah, whom you killed between the sanctuary and the altar. Most certainly, I tell you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jesus is talking specifically to the Pharisees. You are children of those who murdered the prophets, and I'm going to send you disciples who will preach the gospel to you, and you're going to murder them as well. You're going to continue to persecute my people. So I'm going to judge you not only for your sins, but for all the sins of your fathers. And then he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stoned those who are sent to her. How often I would have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. He's talking about how the temple would be destroyed. For I tell you, you will not see me from now on until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Don K. Preston has an excellent explanation what this means about blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I'd encourage you to check out his video on that. Essentially, that is a phrase that the Israelites would repeat to each other during one of their feasts. I think it was Passover, but I'm not sure. When people would come from the surrounding countryside into the city and all over the world into the city, they would say that. And this might have been an indication from Jesus that his parousia would take place on Passover, which of course it did. It was in 66 AD that we saw the events in the clouds a couple weeks after Passover. And in 70 AD, that's the week that the Romans locked the Jews inside of Jerusalem and began their 5-month siege. So this could be Jesus talking about giving them a hint of what time it would come. It'd be on one of the Jewish Passovers. So you see that Isaiah 65 is being fulfilled in Jesus' generation. Deuteronomy 32 is being fulfilled in Jesus' generation. He says it multiple times in multiple places. The temple's going to fall, and of course it did fall in their generation, and that would be the end of Old Covenant Israel. That would be the end of the Old Covenant age, and that's why the disciples asked Jesus, when will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? It would be at the fall of the temple. And it wasn't just the end of the Old Covenant age, it was the opening of the kingdom of heaven. Daniel prophesied how God would establish a kingdom of heaven on earth, which is an invisible kingdom, but he rules and reigns through his people. Christianity, made up of Jews and Gentiles, were all invited into his kingdom by faith. And when this kingdom is established, you had saints who were waiting in Sheol or Hades, who were sleeping and didn't have their resurrected bodies. And when this kingdom of heaven arrived, they would receive their heavenly spiritual resurrected body and be taken up into heaven, where they would dwell in the actual presence of God in heaven itself. And Hebrews talks about this. Although the new covenant had started, the old covenant had not yet faded away. In Hebrews 8:13 it says, in that he says a new covenant, he has made the first old, but that which is becoming old and grows aged is near to vanishing away. So he's talking about how the first covenant, the old covenant, had kind of expired, but it hadn't been removed yet. The temple hadn't fallen. That would happen at the temple's fall. And then later, he talks about how the holy places were a representation of heaven. And he says that the holy places has not yet been made manifest, the first tabernacle still having a standing, which is a symbol for the present time. So in the Old Covenant temple, they had an inner room that only the high priest was allowed into, and only once a year. And this symbolized that access to God's most intimate presence wasn't available as long as the Old Covenant age stood, as their present time existed, as long as that temple still stood. While the first tabernacle was still standing, access into God's most intimate presence wasn't possible. And that's a picture of heaven. See, when they died in the Old Covenant age, they were waiting in Sheol. But when that first tabernacle was destroyed and that present age ended and the new age began, they were invited into God's most intimate presence, into heaven itself. And you can see a couple scripture references where the author calls the holy places, the real holy places, heaven. For Christ hasn't entered into holy places made with hands, which are representations of the true, but into heaven itself. now to appear in the presence of God for us. You see, the earthly tabernacle was modeled off of the tabernacle in heaven, and Christ had entered into the heavenly tabernacle, and that was the real holy places where God's true presence lies. And not until that first temple fell would the saints get access to that. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. See, there was a heavenly Jerusalem, and the innumerable multitudes of angels. And Revelation 11 also connects the days of vengeance, the years of tribulation, the resurrection of the dead, and the judgment, and the temple's fall. You can see it all in Revelation 11, and I'm going to be reading through some of my snippets here, but you can see what I'm going to be quoting in my article. But Revelation highlights the sequence. In verse 2, it says, they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So the angel was telling John that the Gentiles, the Romans specifically, would come and they would destroy the temple. They would attack it for 42 months, which if you do the math on that, that's 3.5 years. Those are the days of tribulation, the days of vengeance. And the temple's destruction is symbolized by a tenth of the city collapsing. Later in Revelation 11, verse 13, he says, "In that day there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell." And I think you can see it right. Let's see here, right here. He also says that 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake. Well, if you look at Old Covenant Jerusalem, the old city in the first century, the temple area took up literally a tenth of the space of the entire city. So when it says a tenth of the city collapsed, that's indirectly saying that the temple was going to be destroyed. And it says that 7,000 people were killed. Josephus estimates that on the month that, or the time that the temple was destroyed, 10,000 people were killed. That was just him estimating. But those are very similar numbers. And so it probably was 7,000, just as is prophesied in Revelation. And you can see my sources for that. And you can look through my blog articles. I'm not sure if I have it in this article, but I might have it in another one. So a tenth of the city falls. And Revelation ends with the kingdom of heaven being established and the resurrection of the dead. In verses 15 and 18, sorry, I keep going to the wrong one. The seventh angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." So this is the beginning of the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And it was also the time for judging the dead and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. So you see that at the time the temple falls, at the time that the days of vengeance and tribulation finish, you have the judgment of the dead, and you have God's kingdom being established. So far we see Hebrews 9 saying that the kingdom of heaven wouldn't be opened. Heaven itself would not be accessible until that first temple fell. And here's Revelation saying that the temple's going to fall, and then heaven's going to be opened, and the judgment of the dead is going to happen. And Daniel 12 talks about the same thing. It details the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked, a 3.5-year period of distress, and the breaking of the Jewish temple's power. And the resurrection is depicted as the righteous shining like stars, symbolizing their entrance into heaven. So when it talks about how we will shine like the stars, it's meaning you're going to go into the heavenly realms, and you're going to be like one of the angels. Daniel 12, verses 1 to 3. At that time. Now, this is really interesting that he says at that time, because Daniel 12 is in the context of Daniel 11. Now, most of Daniel 11 covers history all the way from Persia and the Greek Empire and Antiochus Epiphanes and the abomination of desolation he did in Jerusalem. There's several YouTube videos that go through the history, comparing history with Daniel, and most scholars agree that the majority of Daniel was fulfilled throughout all this history between Persia and Greece and finally Rome. But they start disagreeing when it comes to these last few paragraphs, because it doesn't quite fit Antiochus Epiphanes. And Daniel Moraes with RevelationRevolution.org, He has done some excellent research into this, showing how it actually transitions away from Antiochus Epiphanes and begins talking about Rome Caesars. And especially as you get into this later one, you see Nero being talked about. And then at the very end, the last two verses, this is actually talking about how Nero would come against Jerusalem and pitch the tents of the Roman armies outside to begin his conquest. And Nero died shortly after that happened. He killed himself, but these last two verses, if you want to go and look at Daniel Moraes's work, I'd highly encourage you to do that. Look up his article on Daniel 11, but it talks about how Nero would try to begin a war with Israel right here. And this is the context. And then in Daniel 12, it says at that time. So at this time, he's talking about the time that Nero pitches his tents outside of Jerusalem to begin the siege. Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress. Notice he says there will be a time of distress. This is the days of tribulation, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. Jesus referred to this prophecy and he said that would happen in his generation. For this is the time of distress unequaled from the beginning of the world and never to occur again. But at that time, at this time of distress, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. This is talking about the resurrection, and it's not just of the righteous, others to shame and everlasting contempt. It's talking about the unrighteous as well. When you read Revelation 20, this isn't talking about the first resurrection, because it clearly states it was only the righteous martyrs who were resurrected. If this resurrection includes the wicked dead, it's talking about the second resurrection at the end of the millennium. And what he was saying is that at that time, in this period of distress that would take place in Jesus's generation, the wicked dead would rise. This is the end of Revelation 20, the days of vengeance, the day when Sheol is destroyed and people finally go to heaven. And the day that Sheol is destroyed was prophesied in Deuteronomy 32, how these are the days of vengeance and God will burn Sheol with fire and all the earth. He's talking about the land of Israel there. And it says, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. In this new covenant age, we continue to lead people to righteousness, not the righteousness of our works and trying to earn right standing with God, but by trusting in the only one who actually can be righteous, Jesus Christ himself. And when we tell people the gospel that God is not out to punish you, he is out to show you immeasurable grace paid for by the life of his son. And if you simply believe in that, you can be saved eternally and be right with God and live in peace with God at all times. That is the message we share. And that causes us to shine like the brightness of the heavens. And that's also a depiction of us dwelling in the heavenly realms like the angels. When we die, we go to heaven as Christians. Like the stars forever and ever. That's also a picture that heaven would be opened at this time. No more Sheol, no more Hades. We go straight to heaven. So that's all very exciting. Well, Daniel 12 says that period of distress would be for a time, times, and a half, which the way most scholars interpret this is a time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and a half is half a year. So if you add those together, you get 3.5 years. The same 42 months talked about in Revelation 11. It will be for a time, times, and a half. And when they have finished breaking in pieces the power of the holy people, all these things will be finished. So God was talking to Daniel at this time. And at that time, Israel was his holy people. He's telling them their power was going to be broken. The temple would be destroyed during those years of tribulation, that days of vengeance, times and a half. This is talking about the end of the age. And some more evidence that this is talking about the temple, we can go back to Daniel 9, which is a prophecy about the same period of time. Part of it is. In verses 26 and 27, it says, the people of the prince who come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This is talking about Nero and then how he passed and then Titus finished the job, Titus and Vespasian. But it's saying basically the Roman emperors would come and destroy Jerusalem and the temple. In the middle of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. This is interesting. You'll see this in just a moment. On the wing of abominations, it's that word abominations, will come one who makes desolate and even to the full end. So he's talking about how Nero or Titus would come, the sacrifice and offering would cease, and the temple would be destroyed, and there would be an abomination of desolation set up. And Daniel 12 talks about this. And in verses 11 and 12, it says, well, actually, it's worth seeing the context. So Daniel asks the angel, "My Lord, what will be the outcome? What will the outcome of this be?" And he says, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined. But the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished," we just read that in Daniel 9, "and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of 1,335 days. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance." So they're talking about how the temple would be destroyed, and at the period when those 1,290 days ends, and the 1,335 days, that would be the period when all that prophecy was finished. And Jesus referred to Daniel 12 in his prophecy in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24:15. He says, "When therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet," so he's literally referring directly to this prophecy, "standing in the holy place, for then there will be great suffering." Remember how Daniel 12 talked about how at that time there would be a time of distress that has not existed until now, not been so bad until now. He literally says, "For then there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever will be." And then he says, "Most certainly I tell you, this generation will not pass until all these things are accomplished." So Rome would come, they would destroy Jerusalem and its temple. It would be the worst punishment and distress in history, because remember, Israel wasn't just being punished for their sins, they were being punished for their own generation's sins. They were being punished for all of their fathers' sins, their entire generation. So you might be asking, well, how is the abomination of desolation set up? Well, to the first century Jews, Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem were considered an abomination. And we see this in the parallel in Luke 21, who was writing mostly to a Gentile audience. In Matthew 24, which was written mostly to Jews, it says, "When therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place." But in Luke 21:20, the parallel, it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is at hand." And this should cause us to stop and think, wait a second, he's associating the abomination of desolation with Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. And if you take a look at history, this begins to make sense. Because the Roman legions, they carried images of their gods and Caesar, which violated the Jewish law. So if you read in Exodus 20, verse 4, God says, "You shall not make yourself to carve image in the likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water underneath the earth." And throughout Jewish history, the Romans would try to put these symbols into Jerusalem, and the Jews would come out and protest it, and sometimes say, "We would rather you kill us than you bring these images into our city because it's a violation of our law." And when the Romans saw how dedicated they were in past decades, they relented and they said, "Okay, we'll take these banners down. We'll let you live in peace. We won't have you all kill yourselves." But during that siege in Jerusalem, the Romans did have their banners and they brought them into the city. And that was a violation of the law there. So that was talking about how the abomination of desolation would be set up. And when that happened around May to August of 66 AD, Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem, and a Jewish, he was a son of a priest, Eleazar B. Ananus, the high priest's son, seized control of the temple and transformed it into his shop of tyranny. That's a quote from Josephus. So he talks about how the high priest's son started using the temple in unlawful ways as his shop for tyranny. And he persuaded the priests to reject foreign sacrifices in violation of God's law. So Isaiah 56 in Isaiah 56, God tells the Jews, don't discourage the Gentiles from also making sacrifices to me if they want to come and worship me. And Eleazar was so put off by the Roman armies that he decided to convince the priests not to allow any Gentiles to make sacrifices in the temple. And because of that, the Roman Caesars, he used to make sacrifices in their temple too. And because of that, that started the beginning of the Roman-Jewish War. And so that was the official beginning of the Roman-Jewish War. Well, Eleazar, he removed that Gentile continual burnt offering on around August 17th. The exact date is unknown. The date translation is a little difficult to actually pull off, but it's in the Jewish date, Menachem Av 6. But that would roughly correlate to August 17th in our calendar today. So that's when he removed the burnt offering. And that began the 1,335 days mentioned in Daniel, which if you go from August 17th of AD 66 and you add 1,335 days to it, it takes you right to April 14th at Passover of 70 AD, Nisan 14. And I'm not sure if this date is exactly right, but the Nisan 14 that's the Jewish calendar. But basically, it's exactly 1,335 days from the moment that Eleazar forbid Gentiles from making sacrifices to the Passover of 70 AD, when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, prevented any of the Jews from escaping, and began their 5-month siege of the city. So this is an incredible fulfillment of this. So the fall of the Jewish temple wasn't a fluke in history. It was the climax and demise of the Old Covenant age. This event fulfilled the prophecies concerning Israel's last days and marked the transition into the New Covenant. The first century Jewish generation was identified as the most corrupt and perverse, responsible for rejecting their Messiah and facing divine judgment. Rather than foretelling the end of the physical world, Jesus prophesied the end of the Old Covenant system, which culminated in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. This event signified the arrival of the New Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven, and the new heavens and earth. And we'll be talking about that in a later video, but that's going to be exciting to look into. So, yeah, I hope you were encouraged by this. I hope this is beginning to make sense and tying all these passages together. It was really exciting to understand, and I've been learning this from other people who've done better studies than I have. And so if you have more questions about this, you can try to ask me and I'll answer the best I can, but you can also find great resources on YouTube. You can look at Mike Sullivan, Shelley Sangre with There's No Place Like Home. You can look into Don K. Preston, Ed Stevens. There's a lot of people who've done great work on this. And so I'd encourage you to check out their work. And as always, I pray that you use discernment. You don't take what I say at face value, but you do the study for yourself and you pray and see if these things be true. I know sometimes I'll make mistakes or miss important information. That's just part of being human, but I care about knowing the truth. I care about the truth coming out. And so I hope to honor God in all I do. And I want you to do the same. I want you to go to God for wisdom and ask God for understanding of the end times and trust where He leads you. And again, if you like this kind of content, I highly recommend you check out my book, On Time, specifically the second edition. You actually have to type that in, the second edition, because the first edition is still for sale. So you'll want to get the second edition, and please leave a review if you love it. I really appreciate that. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.